Nice to, I would say, see everybody, but of course, I can do so only doing it. I'm going to crack on because we've got quite a lot to get through. Unfortunately, I'm not going to spend a long time talking about the history of Nevern because I've talked ad nauseum about that at previous Archaeology Open Days. So I'm going to push straight on. We excavated between 2008 and 2018 on this site. It's a project that's run between Nevern Community Council, Pembrokeshire National Park, and ourselves at Durham University. And we've had, as I say, many seasons. That has allowed us to put a total of 52 trenches down across the site. So it's a well-excavated castle, but it's a big place. It's over 3 acres in size, so it's a large castle. And it's really the efforts of local volunteers and students that have allowed us to do all this work. And you can see a sequence of events in case the top of the motte as we found it, then through the excavation to what we revealed, in this case, a round tower, and it's now conserved form. Now, the reason we were at Nevern Castle was because the local community wanted to know about the castle, but my interests are to do with the development of castles in Wales, and particularly about life in the 12th century. Why? Well, this is really the point at which we get modern Wales being established. This merger of Anglo-Norman and existing Welsh peoples is really the origin of modern Wales. And it's difficult to see it on other sites because as we go through the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, a lot of the material kind of contaminates and becomes obscured by later activity. So this site is of interest to us because it really just has a concentration of 12th century material. Now, the site could be divided to 3 basic phases. In the early 12th century, we have the Anglo-Norman Lord Robert Fitzmartin established, and that, whoops, a daisy. And that's really what we're seeing. Initially, a promontory fort, then a motte and some large banks and ditches are formed. We suspect that he formed a town and the site was divided. And you can see on the left-hand side, there was the castle, the right, probably a town. And you can see the artist's impression of what that would look like as a result of the excavation work that we have done. By about 1136, the Battle of Creagmawr means that Anglo forces lose control of Ceredigion and probably North Pembrokeshire. Unfortunately, in the period following this battle, we have very little historical record, and so it's not entirely clear what was going on. But it's at this time, in this mid-12th century period, that we get substantial building on the site. We suspect that this is probably Rhys ap Gruffydd, though it may have started before him, but we're getting substantial building, clay mortared slate, and these are big old buildings. And the emphasis is on these buildings rather than defences. And we wonder that at this point in time, we ought to be thinking more in the terms of describing this as a llys than necessarily a castle. And in the case of the llys, what we're looking at is a series of buildings: hall, chamber, kitchen, stable, beer house, barn, kiln, chapel, latrine, dormitory. These are the kind of ideals that the historical texts tell us we're at least. In practice, I suspect it's a slightly reduced group of that. But what we are seeing are those halls. The East Hall is probably effectively a dormitory area, something which may well equate to a chapel. The Round Tower appears to be where we're having luxury accommodation. Perhaps this is effectively the chamber. And the North Hall and the Inner Castle that subsequently built may all be part of this construction. Eventually, following 2 and 4 between Rhys, the Lord Rhys, as he now becomes, and Henry II, we come to an arrangement, and eventually Cymais, the area which Robert annexed, has handed back to the Fitzmartin family, now William Fitzmartin, Robert's son, who marries Angharad, the Lord Rhys's daughter. And on this period from about 1171 through to 1191, William and Anne Harrod are probably resident for at least part of the year at Nevern. But we're seeing really people adding to the existing castle, but not substantially changing it. We're adding a square tower there. A southern tower, curtain walls probably go up at this time. And we're starting to see the use of gritstone, a nice carvable stone, added to this castle, making it look a lot better than it previously did. After William goes away to the Crusades, we find that the Lord recently captures the castle from Stewart, or perhaps Anne Harrod is also holding it. And then the castle is moved backwards and forwards between the Lord Reese's sons. And at one point, Lord Rees is actually confined here, held prisoner. Eventually, in 1195, Lord Reese's sons house slights the castle, setting it on fire, and effectively removing it as a meaningful defensive structure. Subsequently, it's just a ruin, and everyone comes up from the local village, takes slate away from the site, running away with some of those nice blocks of gritstone to about. Eventually, from the 18th century, we see the area farmed. That's unfortunate for us because it has meant that much of the centre of the castle area has been badly ploughed, and we've lost evidence. Now, if you want to know more, interim reports being published. The website is good and can be visited, and a bilingual guidebook is on its way. Currently has been written and is being translated into Welsh and will be published hopefully fairly shortly. Thomas may be able to give an update on that at the end. I have now moved into the post-excavation phase, moving from taking these corroded lumps of iron and soil that we have recovered from the site through things like x-rays and conservation to reveal the artifacts that we actually came up with. And that's really what I'm here to talk today about. So we'll start with those arrowheads. And you can see that we can create some beautiful things. But when we start looking at what we've got across the 10 years of excavation, we start to see there are particular groups of arrowheads. Initially, we can see we've got some multi-purpose broad-bladed arrowheads, but we find that we have a small number of these very beautiful arrowheads. A lot more forging goes into this kind of second group of arrowheads. And we can see that they're a beautiful shape that take about 3 or 4 times as much time, energy, and effort to create. And in places like Dublin, they are associated with, particularly with Anglo-Norman influence and activity. And so they may well represent something that's being introduced from the site from Anglo-Norman sources. Now, as the quote here shows you, arrows weren't always effective. When we've got these big broad-bladed arrows, they don't always penetrate mail or armor. And at this date, we're really talking about mail, we're not talking about plate armor. And so it's important that your attack and defense go alongside each other. So when we're getting warriors effectively covered in mail, these broad-bladed arrows are not being effective. And towards the end of the site, we see 2 of these bodkin-type arrowheads. And these are fairly specialized, yes, mail. We see them at a much earlier date in Viking Dublin, about the 9th and 10th century, but they become quite commonplace in 13th century Wales, where we get a lot of warfare, and they really are an indicator that the people are wearing mail. It's not just, okay, but that's going on. Okay. Now, there's a lot written about things like longbows, and people worry much about the kind of size of bows, but this is a kind of, this is an abstraction. We've got longbows, we've got big bows since the 10th century in Ballinderry and Ireland. Really, in many cases, what you're wanting is not a big longbow, which is very good at firing an arrow a very, very long way indeed. What you want is accuracy, particularly when you have archers largely concerned with defending the castle, which is, of course, what is largely going on in the case of Nevern. So I think that we're probably looking at smaller bows, and we I'm having problems with my pointer, I regret to say. And we are expectively seeing large areas cleared. It's important to see archery as one of the parts of the castle defence system, not it on its own. Now, part of the defensive systems we're also seeing are things like shield decoration. Now, when you look at other sites, particularly other Anglo-Norman sites in castles, we see these fragments of copper alloy. They don't look very exciting, but when you analyse them, you find the traces of gilding present. And in the lower example, you can see from South Mims that they're cleaned up and they still are gilded. Now, these fixtures and fittings, these bits of copper alloy were originally seen as fixtures and fittings on boxes, but John Lewis, when excavating at Lucker, found so many of them. He also found some examples of illustrations, and we now believe they're part of shields, and you can see fragments here from capital carved in Sicily, which shows these type of pieces of metal present on shields. And it's therefore seen likely that these artifacts are an indicator of the use and presence of shields. Now, when we're thinking about weapon systems, when we think about the Anglo-Normans, we're aware that the main instrument of attack is the heavily mailed knight on a horse. Now, when we look at what we've got from Nevern, we can see that we've got lots of equipment related to horses. We've got stirrups, we've got spurs, we've got bits related to the controlling the horse, and these from a curb bit rather than from a snaffle bit, which is what we see in many later periods. And so a lot of these fragments have to do with control, and that's one of the key things to say about the Norman cavalry. You needed to control the power of the horse and the man on the horse, and so they put a lot of effort into making that so. And so we can see that here we have evidence of how and why this weapon is effective through the stirrups, through the spurs, through the bits. You are controlling this, and that obviously when you ride into other warriors who largely are foot soldiers, you have a lot of impact. Now, as part of this process, what you're seeing are also things like horseshoes. These are illustrated on the Bayeux tapestry, and we find large numbers, but also going with them, the horseshoe nails. And we have an inordinately large number of horseshoe nails, 172. I think we win the contest there. But these were fiddle key horseshoe nails. They projected below the horseshoes, you can see. And what they do is give you grip on soft ground. And that allows you to control the horse and achieve the control that you need. When we look at the size of horseshoes, we can from that determine the size of horses. And these are the size of the horses that we're getting. About 11 horseshoes survive. We've got 11 horses whose size we know from Nevern. We can see there towards the upper end, about 13.5 to 14.5 hands high. And this is what one of those horses would look like, roughly the size. And this is what the cavalrymen of inhabiting Nevern would have been riding. It's important to recognise we have other more domestic activities, but some unusual ones. We've got large numbers of locks, particularly padlocks. They were opened with these slide keys. Some of them are decorated, and when we look again, we find these are concentrated in other 12th century sites around England, and maybe the product of purchases by aristocratic women rather than necessarily men. Now, some of our locks are a little more sinister. Here we have padlocks and shackles, and we have 3 examples of padlocks with shackles. These were used for holding people. I think you would struggle to get those around things like the hoof of a horse or anything else, which has also been suggested. So these are largely about holding people. Now, of course, Nevern is a place of judicial control. The Lord would have exercised his legal rights and would have held people prisoner So shackles may have been used in the judicial process. It's important to recognise that we still had slavery going on at this time. Both Welsh leaders were capturing the people from England and from other opposing forces. People being sold through Bristol. It started as a slave port, largely for Welsh prisoners, through to Dublin, where people were sold. And so, although we don't know that this is what they were being used for at Nevern, it's important to recognise that possibility existed. We do know they were also used for holding things like hostages. And of course, here we have an example, which is copper plated. There's some decorative ribbing here. Why would you make such a nice decorated padlock and shackle? Possibly for a high status prisoner. Is this something that held the Lord Rees? We don't know. We also recognize that the objects, the shackles, were fairly symbolic, fairly powerful symbol. And here we have one that was put in a pit near the start of the castle, the entrance of the castle, possibly an apotropaic symbol, preventing evil spirits from entering. Quickly running through, we can see that we also need other social activities going on. We needed light in order to make those court records. We have evidence of cresset lamp here, and a multiple cresset, a stone cresset, has been recovered, probably close to the chapel, not far away. Here's one from Brecon Cathedral. This is the big one. And what you had was oil or fat in each one of these lamp depressions with a wick. And so you had quite a large light. This is the equivalent of a 150 watt bulb, I guess. That allowed largely people to see and read for nighttime services. So these are normally associated with monasteries or chapels, which is probably what this one's doing there. We were also seeing men, women. We have functional items like knives, but people want to show wealth. They want to display superiority. And here we have a series of banded knives. We have this almost complete one, and then just sections here. Other examples come from other Anglo-Norman castles. And these appear to be, again, something related to castles. So perhaps male fashion. We have a male fashion item. Now, I mentioned the arrival of the gritstone, William Fitzmartin's castle. But we have two pieces here, which were chip-carved saltire pattern cut into this gritstone. We normally see this in the early 12th century, late 11th, in fact, at Chepstow, places like that, and Ludlow. And clearly this, which is also an apotropaic pattern and often seen around windows, as in this case at Chepstow, probably decorated the Great Hall at Nevern. Interestingly, it's not really seen at St David's Cathedral. So we're guessing it's sort of going in around 1170 to Nevern. And the last object I particularly want to draw attention to is one of, this is an apotropaic piece of slate. This was recovered from the square tower. So it's late 12th century. We had many pieces of apotropaic slate, which I talked about in 2012, from the gateway area, fending off evil spirits coming into the castle. This one is very small, as you can see, probably nailed to a door frame or window frame. And we have a sunburst pattern on one side and something like mock writing on the other. Writing was always associated with ecclesiastical activity. And so both of these were symbols that represented the coming of light and Christianity, and would keep evil spirits at bay. And we see other examples of mock writing on things like brooches from a range of sites at this time. Most people were illiterate, so this, as long as it looked like writing, that was enough to convey the idea to the evil spirits and fend them off. So finally, we can see that although the control of the castle varied across the 12th century, with periods with Anglo-Norman and Welsh control, the artifacts that we see are very largely paralleled by other Anglo-Norman sites of the 12th century. It is, however, likely that the construction of the castle, clay bonded slate, occurs in the mid-12th, which is when it's under probably Welsh control. So when we come to look at our overall understanding of what's going on in 12th century Wales, much of which is given us by Raldus Cambrensis in his books describing Journey Through Wales and Description of Wales, we can see some of the things that he is saying are probably not quite true, largely because Giraldus is talking about the peasantry of Wales, the people who work on the land. And actually, there were people building palaces and vast towering structures in stone. But these were the Welsh aristocracy, the Chelwyr. What we're seeing by the 12th century is the fact that it is likely, as something that Giraldus himself says, that we're having an assimilation. The Welsh aristocracy are seeing many of these nice new fancy things from ceramics. We've had about 1/4 ton of ceramics from this site, but also all those lovely objects I'm showing you. And many of these are being made in the Anglo-Norman world in places like Bristol and other sites, I would guess, and being imported in. And as what we're probably seeing is effectively a kind of emerging hybrid Cymric Anglo-Norman culture for the aristocracy of Wales, as well as that of the actual Anglo-Norman lords who are here and present at Nevern. Thank you very much.